There is a specific kind of regret that belongs only to fathers, not to bad men, not to men who abandon their families out of selfishness or cowardice, but to good men, decent, well-intentioned men who got the arithmetic of their lives wrong and poured the best years of their presence into the wrong account. Men who worked when they should have watched, who provided when they should have appeared, who believed, in the way that people believe things they have not examined closely enough, that loving someone and being there for someone were the same thing. They are not the same thing. Most men who make this particular mistake discover this too late to undo it. They spend the rest of their lives in the specific, unresolvable grief of the man who was present in the house and absent. From the childhood, who paid every bill and missed every recital, who kept the lights on and turned them off before the conversations happened, who was, by every external measure, a provider, and who understands now, decades later, that provision without presence is not fatherhood. It is a different thing, done from a different distance, that leaves a different kind of mark. James Earl Cooper was 61 years old. He had been a good provider. He had been a largely absent father. He had known this about himself for the better part of 20 years, and he had carried the knowledge with the particular. The quality of a man who has accepted a verdict about himself and is no longer arguing against it, only living with it. He had come to Family Feud on a Friday afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, because his daughter had arranged the appearance and he had said yes because saying yes to things his daughter arranged was one of the ways he was at 61, trying to be more present than he had been at 31. It was a modest effort. He was not under any illusion that it resolved anything. What happened on that stage, what Steve Harvey said to him, and what turned around resolved, more than James Earl Cooper had believed for 2 decades, was available to be resolved. Subscribe now and stay with this story to the end. This one is for every father who got it wrong and spent the years since wondering whether it was too late to get it right. James Earl Cooper had grown up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the eldest son of a man who had also worked long hours and been largely unavailable, which meant that James had inherited both the template and the absence of any corrective example. His father had provided and been distant, and James had grown up believing this was simply what fathers were. The figure at the edge of the family, who kept everything funded and occasionally appeared at the table. He had married his wife Linda at 26. They had 2 children, a daughter, Tamara, now 33, and a son, Calvin, now 31. James had worked in commercial construction management for 32 years, a career that rewarded presence at job sites and in client meetings, that measured competence through availability and follow-through, that took the qualities James had in abundance: discipline, reliability, early mornings, late evenings, and directed them entirely away from the people at home. Linda had managed the household, the children's schooling, the doctor's appointments, the parent-teacher meetings, the birthday parties, the discipline, the homework, the conversations about growing up that required patience and consistency and time. She had done it without complaint for the most part, and with complaint occasionally, and James had heard the complaint and registered it and not substantially changed his behavior because the work was always urgent, and the family was always there, and the urgency of the present always outweighed the importance of what he was missing. Calvin had been a serious, self-contained child who had developed, by adolescence, the independence of a boy who had learned not to expect his father's attention, and who had reorganized his internal world accordingly. He had not been angry about this, outwardly. He had simply adjusted, built his own structures, found his own references, become, by the time he was 16, a young man who did not require his father's presence because he had long since stopped accounting for it. James had noticed this adjustment when Calvin was 17 and had felt the particular vertigo of a man who has been absent long enough that his absence has been successfully accommodated. He had tried, in Calvin's final year of high school, to rebuild something. The effort had been too late, too inconsistent, and too shaped by James's own guilt to land cleanly. Calvin had left for college in Raleigh, graduated, built a career as a mechanical engineer, married a woman named Brenda, had a daughter now 3 years old, and maintained with his father the civil, carefully managed relationship of a man who had made peace with a reality he could not change. They spoke monthly. The conversations were warm enough and brief enough. James attended holidays. He had met his granddaughter 4 times. He understood, with the lucid self-knowledge of a man who had spent 20 years, examining his own failures, that the relationship was functional and insufficient, and that the insufficiency was his own creation. Linda had stayed in the marriage. She and James were still together at 61 and 60, and their relationship had deepened in the years since the children left, partly because James had finally become more present when presence was no longer structurally demanded by the job, and partly because Linda was a woman of considerable patience and had chosen to extend that patience to the marriage as well as to the children. They were, by their own account, closer now than they had been in the construction years. This did not erase what the construction years had contained. It simply added something better after it. Tamara, the daughter who had organized the Family Feud appearance, had a different relationship with her father than Calvin did. Warmer, less guarded, built on her own personality's greater appetite for reconciliation and her own recognition, as an adult, that her father's failures had been failures of attention rather than failures of love. She had made this distinction explicitly to Calvin on several occasions over the years. Calvin had listened and had not fully agreed and had not argued, because he was a man who had learned to hold complicated things quietly. It was Tamara who had called the production team. She had done so because she believed, with the specific faith of a daughter who loves her father imperfectly and clearly, that Calvin and James needed something they could not manufacture between themselves, a structured, public, witnessed occasion that would require both of them to be present for each other in a way that their private relationship had not yet found the architecture to sustain. Calvin had agreed to come. He had asked Tamara only one question. "Does Dad know I am going to be there?" Tamara had said no. Calvin had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "The Cooper family that arrived at the studio that Friday, James, Linda, Tamara, Tamara's husband, Derek, and Linda's sister, Margaret, played with the warm, competitive ease of a group that had been through enough together to be genuinely comfortable in each other's company." Margaret proved to be the audience's early favorite, with a competitive instinct and a delivery that drew Steve Harvey into an extended exchange that he described as the best. Pre-game conversation of the current season, Linda played with the quiet precision of a woman who has spent decades managing complexity and finds a survey-based game show comparatively manageable. Tamara played with a focused energy that had, beneath it, the particular quality of someone performing one task while carrying awareness of another. James played well. He was steady, methodical, occasionally surprising. The profile of a man who has spent 32 years in an industry that rewards systematic thinking and who brings those habits to whatever he engages with. The audience warmed to him naturally, the way audiences warm to people who are making a genuine effort without making a production of it. Steve Harvey made his way to James during the first break. He asked about the construction career. James described it with the flat, knowledgeable fluency of someone who has been doing one thing for a long time and has stopped needing to make it sound more interesting than it is. Steve asked whether he was retired. James said he had scaled back, took on consulting work, mostly tried to choose the projects that gave him more time at home. Steve said, "More time at home. That is a choice a lot of men make too late." James said without deflection, "Yes, I was one of them." The directness of the answer drew a brief, warm response from the audience, the response of people recognizing someone who has decided to be honest about himself rather than managed. Steve said, "You have kids?" James said, "Two, a daughter, Tamara. She is right there. And a son, Calvin. He is in Raleigh." Steve said he could not make it today. James said he was not invited. Tamara organized this. She did not tell me who all was coming. He said it with a lightness that was slightly effortful, the lightness of a man accustomed to managing the feeling that his son's distance is an appropriate consequence of choices he made and that he does not have the standing to object to. Steve Harvey said, "You and Calvin close." James held the question for a moment. He said, "We are working on it. It took me too long to understand what fatherhood actually required. He was grown before I figured it out. We are both trying to build something now from what is left. It is slower than I would like, and it is mine to be patient about." He said it plainly, without self-pity and without performance. It was the most honest thing he had said in the conversation, and the studio received it as such, a quiet, collective recognition of something real. Steve Harvey nodded once. He did not pursue it. He said, I appreciate that honesty, brother. I appreciate it." He moved back to the game. Tamara had been looking at the floor throughout the exchange. Linda had her hand on James's arm. The Cooper family won the main game in the final round, with a contribution from James that drew the audience to its feet and prompted Steve Harvey to announce that the construction industry had underutilized his talents. The celebration was warm and unguarded. Margaret made a sound that temporarily exceeded the studio microphone's recommended input level. James laughed with the full ease of a man having a better afternoon than he had expected. Then Steve Harvey moved toward the fast money podium setup. He paused. He looked at James with the settled, deliberate expression that every prior episode in this series had preceded with something extraordinary. He said, "James, you told me something a few minutes ago. You said you and your son are working on building something from what is left." James said, "That is right." Steve Harvey said, "I want you to know nothing is left behind." He paused. "It is all still here." He said, "Turn around." James Earl Cooper turned around slowly. Calvin was standing at the back of the stage. He was 31 years old, 6 feet tall, with his father's build and his mother's eyes, wearing the jacket his wife Brenda had helped him choose the previous evening. In their hotel room in Charlotte, he was holding something. It took James a moment to identify it, a moment of adjustment, as his eyes moved from his son's face to his son's hands, and back again. Calvin was holding a photograph. It was from a Little League game in 1999. Calvin was 9 years old. In his uniform, standing at the plate, James had been away on a job that weekend. He was not in the photograph. Linda had taken it from the stay. NES. It was the kind of photograph that exists in family albums as a record of a moment that contained an absence. The photograph in which the missing person's absence is documented by the fact that the camera was held by the person who was always there. Calvin had found it in his mother's album 6 months ago during a visit to Charlotte, and he had taken it with him when he left. He had carried it to the studio that morning. He had not told Tamara he was bringing it. He had simply known, when the production team confirmed the details of the plan, that he wanted to have something in his hands when he walked out. Something that said what he had come to say before he had found the words to say it. James looked at the photograph. He looked at his son. His jaw was tight. His eyes were full. He was working very hard at something, the hard work visible in the set of his face. The effort of a man who is receiving something he does not believe he has entirely earned and who is trying to accept it anyway, because his son has driven from Raleigh and is standing on a stage in Charlotte holding a 30-year-old photograph. And that is not a neutral gesture. He said, "Calvin." Calvin said, "Hey, Dad." The simplicity of those two words, the 31 years of managed distance compressed into a greeting that was entirely ordinary and entirely insufficient and entirely the right thing, moved the studio in a way that no prepared speech could. To Harv, Calvin crossed the stage. James met him halfway, the way fathers meet children when the children have covered most of the distance and the father understands. In the last few steps, that the least he can do is close the gap himself. They held each other. James had his eyes closed. Calvin's face, visible for a moment over his father's shoulder, carried the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had been moving toward for a long time, without fully knowing he was moving and who is. Now that he is here, not certain what comes next, but is prepared to find out. The studio was quiet with the full, complete silence that this series had produced in its best moments. Not the silence of an audience waiting for what comes next, but the silence of people who understand that what they are witnessing is sufficient and does not require anything added to it. Linda Cooper, standing off the stage, had both hands pressed to her face. Margaret was holding her arm. Steve Harvey waited a long time before he approached. When he did, he moved carefully, the way you move near something fragile that is also, in its fragility, entirely strong. He looked at both men. He said, "Calvin, you drove from Raleigh. You brought that photograph." He paused. "I need you to understand something. The man standing next to you has spent 20 years knowing what he got wrong and trying to figure out if there was anything left to build. That is what he told me today." In those words, he looked at James, "And I need you to hear what your son just told you, without words. He drove from Raleigh. He brought the photograph of the game you missed. He is not holding it as an accusation. He is holding it because he wanted you to know that he remembers. That all of it, every game, every year, it is real to him. And he came anyway." James looked at Calvin. Calvin was looking at the photograph in his hands. Then he held it out toward his father. He said, "I thought you should have it." James took the photograph with both hands. He looked at it for a long time. The 9-year-old Calvin at the plate, the empty stands where the father was not. 31 years between the taking and the receiving. He said, "I should have been at that game." Calvin said, "You are here now." The audience rose, and they did not sit down for a long time. The fast money round was completed. James and Tamara stepped to the podium together, and the family won $20,000, which James said immediately he intended to start a college fund for his 3-year-old granddaughter, a decision that he made without discussion. and announced with the straightforward certainty of a man who has identified the most appropriate use of a sum of money and has no interest in deliberating further. Calvin nodded when he heard it. He did not speak, but the nod was full. After the taping, the Cooper family spent 4 hours together at a restaurant in Charlotte that Linda had quietly reserved the previous week. Aware with the comprehensive forward-planning instinct of a woman who had been managing this family's practical needs for 35 years, that whatever happened in the studio would benefit from a continuation in a quieter, more private setting. The dinner was not structured. It was simply a meal. The first meal in which James, Linda, Tamara, Derek, and Calvin had all been present at the same table in over 2 years. Calvin brought Brenda and his daughter, who arrived at the restaurant after the taping had concluded, having driven from Raleigh separately that afternoon. It was the first time James had seen his granddaughter in 8 months. She was 3 years old and entirely unimpressed by the emotional weight of the occasion, which was the correct response, and which made the table easier for everyone. James spent most of the dinner with her on his lap. The conversation between James and Calvin that evening was not the full reckoning that 2 decades of distance might seem to require. It was quieter than that, and more practical, and appropriately incomplete. The first of what both men understood, without saying so directly, would need to be many conversations over many occasions before the distance was genuinely closed rather than simply bridged for an afternoon. Calvin said at one point that he did not want to rehash everything that had happened in his childhood. James said he understood and that the offer was not on the table. What was on the table, James said, was whatever Calvin wanted to build going forward. Calvin said he would think about what that looked like. James said, "Take the time you need. I will be here." When the episode aired 8 weeks after the taping, the photograph became the detail that anchored the public response. The Little League photograph, the game James missed, carried to the studio by the Sun as neither accusation nor absolution, but as evidence that the past was real and present and capable of being held between two people rather than remaining a silent weight between them, was described in thousands of messages and comments as the most precise physical expression of the episode's emotional content that the show had ever produced. Several viewers described it as the moment they understood the full scope of what Calvin was doing by coming, not forgiving his father, not condemning him, but showing him that his absence had been witnessed and survived, and that the surviving did not require the absence to be pretended away. Psychologists and family therapists engaged with the episode extensively in their professional writing, with several noting the particular significance of Calvin's decision to bring the photograph rather than words. The observation was made consistently across different professional contexts that the photograph functioned as a form of testimony that verbal expression rarely achieves, specific, irrefutable, and carrying the evidence of both the loss and the continuation simultaneously. One family therapist wrote, "Calvin did not come to his father with a speech. He came with a document, and the document said everything." Steve Harvey addressed the episode in a reflection that he described as the most personally resonant he had written across the entire series. He wrote at length about James's pre-game honesty, the flat, undefended acknowledgement that he had been absent for too long and that the repair was his responsibility rather than his son's, and said it was the quality of that honesty that had made him certain the moment was right. He wrote, "A man who describes his own failures without minimizing them and without performing remorse, just stating what happened and what it cost and what he is trying to do about it. That man is ready to receive something." James was ready. I could hear it in the way he talked about Calvin. He was not asking for relief. He was just being honest about the size of the thing he carried. That told me everything I needed to know. He also wrote about the photograph, about Calvin choosing to carry it onto the stage rather than leave it in the car or at home or in the drawer where it had presumably been for 30 years. He wrote, "You do not carry a photograph of the game your father missed to a reunion with your father unless you have decided somewhere in yourself that the carrying is the point." Calvin was not delivering evidence. He was delivering himself, his actual history, the specific shape of the absence, and his willingness to stand in front of his father holding it. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing done quietly. Calvin and James spoke by phone the following Sunday. The call lasted 45 minutes, considerably longer than their usual monthly exchange. Brenda told Tamara, in a separate conversation, that Calvin had been quieter than usual in the days after the taping, in the specific way that people are quiet when they are processing something significant rather than something difficult, and that by the weekend, He had settled into something she described as lighter. She used that word specifically, lighter. James drove to Raleigh 6 weeks after the taping for the first time in 3 years. He took his granddaughter to a park on the Saturday morning, while Calvin and Brenda slept in an arrangement that Calvin had suggested and that James had accepted with the careful gratitude of a man who understands that early mornings in parks with 3-year-olds are not an inconvenience, but an inheritance, and that he is being given access to one that he has not fully earned and intends not to waste. The photograph was framed and placed in James's office at home, the same office where he had spent so many evenings working through the years when Calvin was growing up. Linda noted the placement without comment. She understood what it meant for it to be there, in that room, in that specific position where James would see it every time he sat down at the desk that had kept him from the rest of his life for 30 years. She said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The placement said it. Tamara, the daughter whose arrangement of the Family Feud appearance had made everything possible, gave a single interview in which she described her reasoning. She said, "My brother and my father are both good men who had gotten stuck in a pattern that neither of them knew how to break by themselves. I thought if I can put them in the same room in circumstances that require both of them to be present, maybe something shifts." She paused. "I did not know Calvin would bring the photograph. That was his. That was all him." She was quiet for a moment. "But I knew he would bring something. That is who Calvin is. He does not show up empty-handed." The granddaughter turned 4 years old 7 months after the taping. James attended the birthday party. He arrived early, helped set up, stayed late to help clean up. He was the last person to leave. Calvin walked him to his car at the end of the evening, and the two of them stood in the driveway for a few minutes in the way that people stand when they are not quite ready to end the occasion. Calvin said, "Same time next year." James said, "I will be here." He meant it in all the ways the sentence could be meant. Calvin knew that. He said goodnight, and James drove home to Charlotte, and the porch light was on when he arrived because Linda had left it on, as she had always left it on, because that was how she had always said what she meant. If this story reached you, please like this video and subscribe. Say are the moments that remind us it is never too late to turn around. We will see you in the next one.